In October 1795, the streets of Paris were breaking into absolute chaos. Armed royalist insurgents were marching on the National Convention, threatening to overthrow the fragile French Republic and return the country to the monarchy. To defend the government, officials turned to a 26-year-old artillery officer. His solution was immediate and brutal. He ordered his men to load their cannons with small iron balls and fire point-blank into the advancing Parisian mob. The rebellion shattered instantly. Hundreds died on the cobblestones, the crowds scattered, and the Republican government survived the day. History remembers this massacre as the whiff of grape shot. The central historical tension of this moment is how a practically unknown, incredibly young soldier was entrusted with the Republic's survival during its most vulnerable hour. To understand his rapid ascent, we have to look backward. Extreme marginalization and isolation built an engine of relentless, ruthless drive. The timeline begins 26 years earlier, in 1769. Napoleon Bonaparte was not born into French high society. He was born into a minor noble family on Corsica, an island that had fallen under French control only the year before his birth. At the age of 9, his family secured him a scholarship, and he was shipped off to elite mainland French military academies. He arrived with very little money and spoke only a rough, heavily accented French. Surrounded by the sons of wealthy French aristocrats, he faced intense social isolation. His classmates relentlessly mocked his rural origins, his limited vocabulary, and his awkward demeanor. The young boy retreated inward. He developed a fiercely guarded temperament, insulating himself by reading everything he could find on history, geography, and military theory. He applied himself to his formal education with obsessive rigor, discovering a highly specialized natural aptitude for mathematics and geometry. He mastered French military tactics as a means to eventually win independence for his home island. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Napoleon saw his opportunity. He took frequent, extended leaves from his regiment, returning to Corsica again and again. He immersed himself in the messy, factional politics of the island, aligning himself directly with the famous Corsican nationalist leader, Pasquale Paoli. By 1793, that political alliance completely collapsed. A bitter falling out with Paoli turned dangerous, forcing the entire Bonaparte family to flee the island under the threat of violence. He arrived in mainland France as a stateless refugee. The childhood dream of leading a liberated Corsica was dead. This forced exile triggered a critical psychological pivot. With no home to return to, he redirected his intense outsider ambition and sharp tactical mind toward navigating the turbulent, dangerous reality of the French state. His first major opportunity arrived late in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon. Royalist rebels had seized the highly strategic coastal port and invited the British Navy in to support them. The revolution had created a massive structural vacuum within the military. The traditional aristocratic officer class that normally would have commanded such a siege had either fled the country or been purged by the new regime. Because of this leadership void, when the Republican artillery commander was wounded, command of the siege cannons fell to the 24-year-old Napoleon. This top-down schematic illustrates his tactical solution. Napoleon mapped the bay's geometry, identifying elevated promontories offering optimal trajectory coverage over the anchored fleet. Capturing that high ground, he established overlapping arcs of fire, relentlessly bombarding the harbor and forcing the British ships to withdraw. The victory was decisive. For his role at Toulon, the Republican government promoted him to brigadier general at just 24 years old. Under the rigid hierarchy of the pre-revolution monarchy, achieving that rank would have required decades of slow, methodical progression. Toulon proved that the chaotic power vacuum of the new French state rewarded his specific mathematical specialization and unyielding personal drive. Survival in 1794 demanded political calculation alongside military skill. The radical Jacobin government collapsed, Robespierre was executed, and the threat of the guillotine hung over anyone tied to the old factions. Because of his earlier political associations with radical figures, Napoleon fell under deep suspicion. He was abruptly arrested and imprisoned. He did not panic. Instead, he drafted precise strategic appeals to the new authorities that secured his release without prosecution and restored his military standing. Forced him to become a political survivor, teaching him to navigate the lethal conflicts within the government. Which brings the timeline back to the Paris Uprising of 1795. When the government needed someone to defend the capital, they looked to the young general who had proven his decisiveness at Toulon. By deploying his artillery against the insurgent crowds, he saved the fledgling French Directory government. By age 26, the mocked Corsican student was the most celebrated military figure in the Republic. The bullied Corsican boy used the chaos of the revolution to build a foundation of influence and technical reputation, uniquely positioning him to eventually challenge for control of the entire European continent. By 1795, the French Republic was fighting for its survival. The Reign of Terror had left the government fractured, and the Directory, France's new governing body, desperately needed military order to prevent a complete collapse. Their solution was to delegate the defense of the state to a rising, highly capable young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1796, the Directory handed him a clear mandate: take command of the French army of Italy and push back the combined Austrian and Piedmontese forces threatening revolutionary expansion. This created a profound political risk. Giving an exceptionally ambitious and brilliant commander an army to protect a fragile government meant giving him the leverage to eventually control it. In their desperation to find a sword that could defend their fractured democracy, the French Republic was unwittingly recruiting the man who would tear it down. Once in command, Napoleon executed a genuinely spectacular military campaign. Relying on rapid troop movements and highly aggressive tactical engagements, he secured a string of decisive victories at Lodi, Arcalay, and Rivoli. This map shows Italy's fragmented territories. Napoleon's victories tore through these borders, forcing Austria to sue for peace. Across these northern territories, we see the massive scale of the Treaty of Campo Formio, which he negotiated by deliberately ignoring Paris to dictate his own terms. Napoleon was now conducting high-level diplomacy as an independent sovereign power, dictating terms that reshaped Europe's map without consulting his superiors in Paris. At the exact same time his public authority was expanding, his personal life became deeply entangled. Shortly before leaving for the Italian campaign, he entered an intense, passionate marriage with Josephine de Beauharnais. The marriage quickly faced financial strains from Josephine's spending, but a far more consequential political issue loomed: their apparent inability to produce children. A childless marriage meant no legitimate heir for a man whose ambitions were rapidly outgrowing a democratic republic. By the end of 1797, the Italian campaign had proven that Napoleon could win impossible wars. More dangerously for the Directory, it proved he no longer needed Paris to govern the lands he conquered. Recognizing his surging personal popularity, a terrified Directory calculated that they needed him far away from domestic politics. They authorized his next major undertaking, the 1798 Egyptian campaign. This map shows Egypt's strategic position in the Mediterranean. The operation offered Napoleon glory while disrupting British trade routes for India. Following the path into the Nile Delta, French forces achieved immediate success, capturing Cairo just after the Battle of the Pyramids. This ornate engraving of Egyptian ruins illustrates a parallel objective of the invasion. Napoleon brought along a substantial contingent of scholars and scientists, initiating a massive effort to catalog the region that would eventually birth modern Egyptology. Among these achievements was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone by French soldiers in 1799. The artifact's 3 distinct inscriptions allowed linguists to cross-reference known Greek text with previously unreadable hieroglyphics. Napoleon promoted the scientific prestige of these discoveries to ensure his reputation remained intact at home. On the ground, however, his strategic position was becoming untenable. In August 1798, the French supporting fleet was destroyed by British Admiral Horatio Nelson in a catastrophic naval engagement at the Battle of the Nile. The immediate consequence was crippling. Napoleon's army was entirely stranded in Egypt, completely cut off from any reliable sea withdrawal or prospect of French reinforcement. A desperate subsequent push into Ottoman-controlled Syria failed, leaving the French forces increasingly isolated and exposed to continued British naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Fully aware of deteriorating political conditions back in France under the deeply unpopular Directory, Napoleon made a highly calculated decision in August 1799. He secretly boarded a ship and abandoned his men. He traded basic military propriety for pure political opportunism. He gambled correctly that the cultural victories he had manufactured in Egypt would outshine the reality of a stranded expeditionary force. When Napoleon returned to France in October 1799, he found a political environment perfectly aligned with his ambitions. The corrupt and ineffective Directory was facing widespread terminal public anger. This illustration captures the dynamic of the moment. Exploiting the massive power vacuum, he partnered with political co-conspirators to plot the government's overthrow. The coup of 18 Brumaire was genuinely chaotic. Napoleon's initial confrontation with opposing legislative deputies nearly derailed the entire conspiracy. Ultimately, the unwavering backing of the military salvaged the bungled coup. The troops expelled the resisting lawmakers, forcing the permanent dissolution of the Directory. In its place, the conspirators established a new consulate government, placing Napoleon in the position of first consul. The structural reality of this new title was absolute. It granted Napoleon effectively supreme executive political authority, permanently stripping power away from representative bodies. He used the Republic's own armies and its desperate need for order to dismantle the government from within. The long, turbulent search for stable authority was over, replaced by Napoleon's own era of absolute imperial rule. Though often remembered as an army commander, Napoleon's absolute power depended on an extensive, durable overhaul of domestic administration, a new administrative machine. By late 1799, a decade of radical revolution had left France reeling. The economy was depleted, the public was weary of constant warfare, and the basic systems of civil governance had largely broken down. Napoleon assumed executive authority under a new constitution as first consul, yet his position remained precarious. He was taking charge of a nation where political leaders were frequently removed by force or execution when factions shifted. Internal instability remained a constant, lethal threat. Military victories on the frontiers could expand borders, but they could not prevent the French state from collapsing under the weight of its own domestic chaos. To secure his rule, Napoleon needed to build an administrative machine that functioned with enough precision to make his governance essential to the daily lives of the French people. He began by replacing the variable local councils of the Revolutionary era with a system of centrally appointed prefects, bringing the governance of every French department under the direct supervision of Paris. He then moved to address the state's devastated public finances, implementing measures to stabilize an economy that had been exhausted by years of turbulence. Established in 1800, the Banque de France provided the institutional framework necessary to restore financial order and effectiveness to the French state. For a society drained by a decade of revolutionary upheaval, the return of reliable civil administration was a significant and welcome change. By delivering this level of practical effectiveness, Napoleon established a sense of order that allowed his centralized authority to take root. Napoleon also targeted the cultural fracture between the state and the Catholic Church, which had been severely disrupted by the radical anti-clerical policies of the Revolution. Through the Concordat of 1801, he negotiated a landmark agreement with Pope Pius VII that restored the Church's official status in France. His private religious views remained secular and pragmatic. He pursued this reconciliation primarily to win over a population that remained deeply attached to their faith. The treaty successfully neutralized a major source of internal opposition while ensuring that church administration and appointments remained firmly under state control. This map shows the legal landscape Napoleon inherited, a fragmented collection of regional traditions varying across every province of France. Napoleon personally oversaw the drafting of a unified civil law system designed to replace these inconsistent customs with a single set of rules. Promulgated in 1804, the Code Civil established a unified legal identity for the nation. The code enshrined several key revolutionary principles, such as secure property rights and the legal equality of all male citizens, regardless of their social standing or birth. Yet it also codified a strictly patriarchal structure, subordinating the legal authority of wives to their husbands in matters of property and family decision-making. By defining these rules, Napoleon fused revolutionary ideals with a centralized legal framework that dictated the terms of French civic life. The stability provided by these reforms translated into significant political leverage, allowing Napoleon to win referendums naming him consul for life and eventually Emperor of the French. In December 1804, Napoleon formalized this transition to an imperial monarchy during an elaborate ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral. In a moment widely noted by those in attendance, Napoleon took the imperial crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placed it on his own head. This act signaled that his imperial authority derived from his own achievements and the collective will of the state, rather than through traditional religious or divine sanctions. This chart compares two different aspects of Napoleon's reign. While his territorial conquests peaked and then crashed within a single decade, his domestic administrative system stayed in place for centuries. The dramatic collapse of the French military empire did not erase the reforms he established within the civil state. The Napoleonic Code provided the legal foundation for civil law systems adopted across continental Europe and within former European colonies around the globe. While popular historical memory is often fixated on the movement of his armies, his most lasting influence is found in the machinery of modern governance. Napoleon's most historically consequential achievement was the creation of the modern bureaucratic and legal structures that continued to function long after his territorial gains had vanished. In December 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of the French. This escalation coincided with the resumption of total war, ending a brief 2-year peace. Viewing this new imperial authority as a direct threat, the major European powers coalesced into a series of military alliances designed to contain French expansion. Napoleon's primary strategic objective lay across the water. He massed an army on the coast, planning to strike at his most persistent rival through a cross-channel invasion of Great Britain. That plan was frustrated in October 1805. Off the coast of Spain, at the Battle of Trafalgar, the combined French and Spanish naval fleets were decisively defeated. The British fleet, commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson, secured absolute naval supremacy for the remainder of the war, permanently foreclosing the prospect of a French invasion of the British Isles. With the sea blocked, Napoleon was forced to pivot his strategic focus. For the remainder of his reign, his military campaigns would be fought almost exclusively on the European continent. By late 1805, a massive combined force of Austrian and Russian troops moved against the French army in Central Europe. This tactical map shows Austerlitz. Napoleon weakened his right flank, creating a vulnerable opening. Austro-Russian forces concentrated their attack there, pulling units from their center. Napoleon immediately counterattacked into the new gap, splitting the coalition in two. The decisive victory at Austerlitz forced Austria out of the war and cemented Napoleon's reputation for tactical innovation on land. In 1806, French momentum continued with the defeat of Prussia at Jena and Auerstedt. The resulting occupation of Berlin effectively removed Prussia as a significant independent power. This winning streak led to the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. An alliance between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I confirmed French dominance over much of the continent. Napoleon began reorganizing the newly conquered territories, establishing satellite kingdoms in Italy, Naples, Westphalia, and Warsaw, often governed by his own family members. This map shows the fragmented borders of Central German states. Napoleon consolidated these into the Confederation of the Rhine. This reorganization formally ended the thousand-year Holy Roman Empire in 1806, removing the ancient political structure that defined Central Europe for centuries. By 1812, the map reveals the extent of this project. Napoleon had successfully rebuilt the geopolitical landscape of Europe into a centralized system designed to serve French administrative and military goals. Despite his control of the mainland, Napoleon still lacked a way to defeat Britain militarily. He turned to economic warfare. The Continental System, established in 1806, was a comprehensive trade embargo designed to block British goods from all French-controlled and Allied ports. While the embargo strained the British economy, it also damaged the economies of Napoleon's allies and subjects, whose livelihoods depended on trade with Britain. The resulting economic hardship generated deep resentment. Across the empire, political support began to erode as the costs of maintaining the blockade became increasingly apparent. The continental system transformed Napoleon's unified European bloc into a set of territories held together by force rather than mutual interest. Enforcing the blockade required total control of the coastline. In 1808, to close gaps in the trade barrier, Napoleon moved his armies into Spain and Portugal. This initiated the Peninsular War, a conflict that combined conventional military engagement with persistent, difficult-to-suppress guerrilla resistance from the local population. For several years, this conflict acted as a drain on French resources, requiring the constant presence of hundreds of thousands of troops to maintain control. The struggle in Spain highlighted the practical difficulty of policing a rapidly expanded empire, where the local populations were increasingly hostile to French rule. At the peak of his geographic expansion, the continuous effort to economically isolate Britain had committed Napoleon to a series of costly engagements that would eventually exhaust his military resources. By the late first decade of the 19th century, Napoleon held dominion over Europe. Yet within his quiet corridors of power, a deadline rapidly approached. The French Empire, recently forged through years of military conquest, lacked a legitimate biological heir. Without a son to inherit the throne, the continuity of the Bonaparte dynasty would likely end with his own life. The emperor already knew he was capable of fathering children, having produced at least one illegitimate son with a mistress. He concluded the reproductive difficulty rested entirely with his wife, Josephine. Decisive battlefield victories secure territory, but only bloodlines secure empires. This ongoing childlessness represented a fatal strategic vulnerability for the new regime. Surviving correspondence between the couple reveals a genuine, deep-seated affection. Their marriage had been characterized by real emotional attachment from its earliest days. But in 1809, despite considerable distress recorded on both sides, Napoleon initiated a formal divorce. He pursued this separation strictly out of dynastic requirement. He maintained an affectionate correspondence with Josephine for the rest of her life, making clear the decision was devoid of personal preference. He severed his closest human relationship in service to a cold mathematical reality. To secure his empire's permanence, no personal attachment was safe from elimination. The following year, in 1810, Napoleon contracted a new marriage to Marie-Louise. She was the Archduchess of Austria and daughter of the Austrian Emperor Francis I. The arrangement solved two diplomatic problems at once. For Austria, it established a more stable relationship with the dominant French power after repeated military defeats. For Napoleon, it grafted his upstart empire onto one of Europe's most prestigious historical royal houses. In March 1811, the union yielded exactly what the emperor required: the birth of a healthy, legitimate son. Named Napoleon François Joseph Charles Bonaparte, the infant was immediately designated the King of Rome, projecting an aura of historical and imperial authority before he could even walk. Contemporary accounts note the emperor's profound satisfaction. By producing a biological heir, he had fulfilled his most pressing ambition and seemingly cemented the future of the Bonaparte line. A dynasty, however, requires a secure physical domain to inherit. To the east, the formal alliance with Russia, established by the 1807 Treaty of Tilsit, was deteriorating. This map shows the economic mechanics of Napoleon's continental system. The trade barriers designed to starve Britain were also choking off Russian maritime trade, inflicting severe economic hardship. Beyond trade, unresolved territorial claims over Poland created deep structural mistrust between the two powers. To insulate his newly secured bloodline, Napoleon determined that he had to force the Russian Tsar into absolute compliance. In June 1812, Napoleon ordered an invasion. This chart illustrates the sheer density of the invading force. Drawing soldiers from across his allied and subject territories, Napoleon assembled a multinational army numbering between 400,000 and 600,000 men. No single European military force had ever reached this size. The French tactical doctrine relied on drawing the enemy into a swift, decisive confrontation early in a campaign to dictate the terms of surrender. The Russian forces refused to provide that confrontation. Instead, they continuously and deliberately pulled back deep into their own country. By trading land for time, the Russian strategy pulled the enormous French army into an increasingly extended and logistically precarious position. A massive clash finally occurred at Borodino in September 1812. It proved to be the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, yet it offered no conclusive strategic victory. When Napoleon's forces marched into Moscow, they expected a formal capitulation. They found a largely evacuated capital. Within days of the French arrival, extensive fires swept through the city's architecture. Whether deliberately set by authorities or sparked by the chaos of occupation, the result was a ruined urban center. Napoleon possessed the Russian capital, but no Russian government was willing to negotiate a peace settlement. His enormous army was now stranded deep inside hostile territory. By October 1812, with no treaty in hand and the Russian winter approaching, the emperor was forced to order a retreat. The march backward compounded every existing operational error. Russian forces continually harassed the flanks, while remaining supplies dwindled to nothing. The weather collapsed into brutal, freezing temperatures, breaking the remaining supply lines entirely and inducing widespread starvation. The largest and most formidable invasion force in European history was methodically annihilated in the brutal Russian snow. Of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who marched eastward that summer, only a tiny fraction survived to limp back into French-controlled territory. Napoleon had orchestrated a divorce, married an archduchess, and invaded a massive empire, all to guarantee his dynasty would outlast him. Instead, the resulting catastrophe destroyed the military foundations required to sustain his rule. For a decade, Napoleon's dominance over Europe was the defining reality of the continent. His armies moved with a reputation for success that left rivals contained, and his various allies in a state of reluctant obedience. The catastrophic campaign into Russia proved that Napoleon's forces could be decimated. Watching the Grande Armée dissolve in the winter retreat, the rest of Europe realized that French military supremacy was no longer a certainty. This vulnerability created a narrow window for action. Sensing that the French army was at its weakest point in years, rivals and subordinate states began to coordinate a strike. The result was the Sixth Coalition, a massive alliance that grew to include Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, and Sweden. For the first time, Napoleon was physically encircled by the combined weight of nearly every major power in Europe. Napoleon now faced a coordinated front. Instead of fighting isolated campaigns against individual nations, he was forced to defend against the synchronized advance of a unified continent. The Russian campaign did more than deplete Napoleon's ranks. It broke the psychological fear that had kept the empire stable. As the perception of his dominance evaporated, his former partners shifted their allegiances, turning the entire map against France. Even after the ruinous losses of 1812, Napoleon demonstrated a shocking resilience. Through 1813, he managed to levy a new army, replacing his lost veterans with fresh conscripts. This rebuilt force initially achieved several successes during the German campaign, creating a brief impression that he might push the coalition back. That hope vanished in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, the most decisive engagement of the war. This chart shows the disparity at Leipzig, often called the Battle of the Nations because of the unprecedented scale of the forces involved. The unified coalition fielded such a massive volume of soldiers that Napoleon's newly raised army was simply overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The result was a comprehensive defeat that shattered Napoleon's strategic position in Central Europe. Napoleon was forced into a full retreat across the Rhine. By crossing back into French territory, he effectively abandoned the external empire he had spent a decade building. Leipzig confirmed that military genius could no longer compensate for a total lack of resources. The age of French imperial dominance had effectively ended. In early 1814, the coalition crossed the Rhine. For the first time in years, the war was being fought on French soil as the Allied armies marched toward Paris. The strategic situation was hopeless. The coalition held a massive advantage in manpower and materials that the exhausted French state could not match. Despite this, Napoleon conducted a series of defensive campaigns, still cited for their tactical brilliance. He moved rapidly, winning several localized victories against the invading columns. However, these tactical wins could not halt the overall advance. The sheer mass of the coalition forces allowed them to absorb these losses and continue moving toward the capital. The pressure finally reached its limit at the end of March 1814, when Allied forces successfully entered Paris. Even as his capital fell, Napoleon remained inclined to fight on, seemingly determined to continue the struggle regardless of the odds. His senior commanders reached a different conclusion. Recognizing that continued resistance was militarily futile, they refused to support his orders for further combat, effectively forcing him to stop. The empire fell not because Napoleon lost his skill on the battlefield, but because his own generals finally forced him to acknowledge a mathematical reality he could no longer overcome. In April 1814, Napoleon formally signed his abdication at the Palace of Fontainebleau. The terms of his surrender were unusually generous. He retained his imperial title and was granted a substantial financial pension by the victorious powers. Napoleon was given sovereign authority over Elba, a small Mediterranean island. It was a place of exile, yet he remained a monarch, albeit over a tiny territory. This arrangement reflected a deep disagreement among the Allies. While some wanted a harsher punishment, others still held a cautious respect for Napoleon's symbolic stature and political influence. The political costs were accompanied by a profound personal loss. His wife, Marie-Louise, and their young son did not join him on Elba, returning instead to Austria under her father's protection. This separation would prove permanent. Napoleon would never see his son again, a personal blow that weighed on him as heavily as the loss of his empire. To the rest of the world, it appeared the Napoleonic era had reached its final conclusion. The Allies' decision to leave Napoleon with his imperial title and a Mediterranean base created an unstable peace. Rather than concluding his career, the exile on Elba set the stage for one of history's most sudden political returns. In May 1814, the victorious Allied powers of Europe exiled Napoleon Bonaparte to the Mediterranean island of Elba. The intent was permanent removal from the continent. But back in France, the newly installed Bourbon monarchy was actively alienating the public. King Louis XVIII instituted reactionary policies that quickly generated widespread resentment among a population accustomed to the reforms of the past decade. This political friction was most dangerous within the French military. Serving officers and seasoned soldiers found themselves taking orders from royalists they despised, while maintaining a fierce devotion to the emperor who had led them through years of continuous continental warfare. From his coastal vantage point, Napoleon monitored this growing instability. He recognized that the restored monarchy sat atop a political powder keg, requiring only a single spark to ignite. In late February 1815, Napoleon departed Elba and landed in southern France, accompanied by a small force of approximately 1,000 loyal soldiers. As they marched toward Paris, they met a critical obstacle at Grenoble. Armed royalist forces were garrisoned there, explicitly dispatched to intercept and arrest him. Napoleon approached the opposing troops alone and unarmed. He declared that if any soldier wished to kill his emperor, he stood right before them. Rather than opening fire, the assembled troops defected enthusiastically. This triggered a cascading reaction, with military units at every stage of his advance abandoning their royalist commanders to join his column. Within 3 weeks of his landing, Napoleon reached Paris and reclaimed his throne without a single shot fired in serious resistance. Yet this bloodless restoration instantly initiated a countdown to a massive continental war. News of the escape reached the European leaders while they were still assembled at the Congress of Vienna, negotiating the post-war settlement. Their reaction was immediate and unified. The coalition took a severe legal step, officially declaring Napoleon an international outlaw. This mandate removed any possibility of diplomatic negotiation or a peaceful, recognized reign in France. This map illustrates the massive military mobilization. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia engineered a coordinated advance to encircle France. The mathematics were absolute. It was impossible for Napoleon to survive a combined assault by all four forces at once. Trapped by these converging armies, Napoleon determined that his only viable strategic option was to launch a preemptive strike, aiming to destroy the coalition forces one by one before they could unite. In June 1815, the French army pushed into Belgium, driving a rapid offensive wedge directly between the British and Prussian armies. The tactic succeeded. At the Battle of Ligny, Napoleon pushed the Prussians eastward, separating them from their British allies. With the Prussians seemingly dealt with, Napoleon pivoted the bulk of his army. He marched toward the village of Waterloo to force a decisive confrontation with Wellington's British and Allied forces on the 18th of June. The entire campaign now depended on timing. Napoleon had to shatter Wellington's lines before the wounded Prussian army could recover, reorganize, and march back to the battlefield. Wellington anchored his forces along a carefully selected defensive ridge. This terrain allowed him to shelter his infantry from French artillery fire while absorbing direct assaults. Throughout the day, the combat devolved into sheer attrition. Repeated French cavalry charges hammered the Allied positions, crashing against the defensive lines, but they failed to trigger a collapse. By late afternoon, the tactical situation shifted. Field Marshal Blücher's Prussian forces arrived far more rapidly than anticipated, slamming directly into the exposed French flank. Facing encirclement, Napoleon committed his final reserve. He ordered the historically undefeated Imperial Guard forward in a desperate wager to break the British center. The Allied lines held, and the Imperial Guard was repulsed. The sight of these elite veterans retreating instantly broke the morale of the broader French army, triggering a chaotic total rout. The tactical brilliance that had defined Napoleon's career could not overcome the sheer scale of the opposition. Individual military genius was finally crushed by the institutionalized power of a united European coalition. Napoleon fled the ruined battlefield and returned to Paris. He briefly attempted to rally the government, but found that his political capital and military support were completely exhausted. On the 22nd of June, 1815, just over 3 months after his return, he abdicated for a second time. The extraordinary episode known as the 100 Days was brought to an abrupt and permanent close. Having seen the consequences of the lenient Elba arrangement, the victorious powers altered their approach. They refused to grant him a geographically close exile ever again. They imposed a much harsher punishment, banishment to a remote, inescapable island far from the shores of Europe. Napoleon's charisma had engineered an improbable return to power, but it directly provoked his absolute destruction. The scale of the loss was so definitive that the word Waterloo permanently entered the English language as the ultimate synonym for inescapable, final defeat. Following his second abdication in 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte looked toward the United States, requesting passage in hopes of a quiet retirement in relative freedom, but the victorious Allied powers were determined to avoid a repeat of his escape from Elba. They decided his next confinement would be a location defined by its practical inaccessibility. They selected St. Helena, a British possession in the remote South Atlantic, located thousands of kilometers from the European coastline. Unlike the porous satirity of his previous exile, the arrangements here were intended to ensure this second confinement remained genuinely final. The Allied powers had designed a geographic tomb, using the island's isolation to remove Napoleon from the world stage. Napoleon arrived in October 1815, moving into Longwood House, a residence he would occupy for the remaining 5.5 years of his life. He and his retinue frequently criticized the property as damp and poorly situated. To the former emperor, the residence was an inadequate shelter that served as a daily reminder of his reduced status. These conditions fueled a persistent resentment toward the British governor, Hudson Lowe. Lowe's administration of the confinement was viewed by Napoleon's circle as needlessly punitive, creating a relationship defined by documented friction. The man who once commanded millions and dictated the laws of nations was now powerless, his daily conduct strictly restricted to the confines of a single island and the constant oversight of a jailer. Trapped in these conditions and stripped of his military power, Napoleon began to develop a new strategy to preserve his influence. Napoleon responded to his isolated confinement by launching a calculated campaign to shape exactly how history would remember him. He spent much of his time dictating extensive reflections and memoirs to a small circle of companions, most notably Emmanuel de las Cases. The resulting record, titled The Memorial of St. Helena, presented a version of his career that smoothed over his military failures and presented a heroic image to the public. He used these dictations to highlight his administrative reforms, framing his legacy in terms that were more idealized than the complex reality of his time in power. This was an act of historical self-fashioning. He shifted his focus from the battlefields of Europe to the minds of the 19th century public, building a mythology that would prove as durable as his actual military achievements. While he worked to secure his literary immortality, his physical health declined steadily. The exiled emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. Although his death was initially attributed to stomach cancer, dark theories of deliberate arsenic poisoning have circulated for decades, fueled by the detection of the substance in samples of his hair. Most researchers now consider those levels attributable to common 19th century exposure, such as wallpaper pigments. Mainstream medical scholarship maintains the diagnosis of stomach cancer. Even so, the mundane medical reality was quickly complicated by these romanticized conspiracies, further blurring the line between the man and the martyr. The British successfully kept his body on the island for nearly 20 years, but the myth he had dictated was already sweeping across the continent. The memorial became enormously influential, paving the way for a national rehabilitation of his image within France. By 1840, King Louis-Philippe authorized the exhumation of his remains, returning them to Paris for a massive state ceremony. He was interred at Les Invalides, an act that officially transformed him from an exiled prisoner back into a central figure of French national commemoration. The exiled prisoner died on St. Helena, but the persona he constructed during those final years eventually returned to occupy a place of honor in the heart of Paris. 2 centuries after his death, historians continue to weigh the reality of his actions against the narrative he built on St. Helena. This is an 1807 edition of the Napoleonic Code. This system replaced localized legal customs with a uniform code and established the administrative institutions that still characterize modern French civil service. But his strategy also resulted in nearly continuous European warfare for over 15 years. This data visualization tracks the areas of conflict generated by his ambitions for continental domination. Historical estimates indicate the human cost of these campaigns reached several million deaths across the continent. St. Helena was designed to erase Napoleon from history. Instead, the isolation gave him the focus needed to forge the duality of his legacy as both a modernizing reformer and an authoritarian conqueror that continues to drive scholarly debate today.